Okay, let's talk about our patch pockets. So remember, we have a curved pocket and then we have a western pocket. Let's talk about the curved pocket first. So first, let's have a look at this. Does it visually look good? So visually it does look pretty good. I can actually point out a couple of things right now that I might want to correct, or actually just go ahead and do a whole nother sample. So the first thing, again, we're going to be looking at is stitch consistency on both the pocket flap, the stitch down on the pocket flap, and then of course the stitch consistency around the pocket to stitch it on. And remember, we have a rolled hem here, so I might just open this up or just roll it back and just kind of see where did I stitch? Did I stitch right here on this edge? And I did, so that's what I want to see. So let's have a look here at the bottom of the curve. These are going to be our trouble areas. And I maybe could have spent a little bit more time with that pressing template to get these edges a little bit nicer curved. It looks maybe I was like in a little bit of a hurry, and that's bad on me. So I might have just tucked this under just a little bit because it's kind of poking out a little bit just right here. But aside from the edge of the pocket, the stitching still looks pretty consistent. So that just may be a visual thing. It also may be this is actually muslin, and muslin is not really very forgiving. If this were wool, this would be able to be pressed out because the wool would stretch with a little bit of steam. But the stitching looks consistent. I might just kind of circle this area here and this area here, and I might maybe take a half a point off of it because everything else looks so nice and smooth, and it's done very well. One of the other things I would like to point out is that I'm going to fold this pocket flap up really quickly. Remember, we trimmed off some of this seam allowance. I don't want to see any of that seam allowance poking through or any threads, and that's just an extra yarn there that we can take away. So I don't see any of that cut edge of that seam allowance, so that's nice. Everything is nicely hidden. The other thing that I would kind of look at, if you didn't mark it and you turn this in, I would probably feel here, can I pull this away? The reason I would do that is because I want to make sure that the top pocket flap is the piece that has been fused with your interfacing. So if it's not that, then I might take off a few points because that's a no-no. So that's why I marked differently these lines, and these lines are different. So I knew that these crosses were the under flap, so I didn't make a mistake. So those are the things that I would point out. I might also look at the underside and see how well that stitching is if I can't see it exactly on the other side, but the underside looks pretty good and this top side looks good. If you want to do another pocket to correct any curves, that would be great, but this one actually looks pretty good. So we can label this. So I'm actually going to put the label up here at the top. So this is my curved, I may as well say patch pocket, right? And with flap. And then I've got my name and the date. All right, and so now this one is ready to go into your notebook. So let's talk about this western pocket. So the western pocket is because we have this point here and we have a point on the pocket flap. Again, we're going to look at the stitching consistency. The stitching looks actually pretty good all the way around this edge. We have nice points, corner points. We press those really well. We've got back stitching here. Again, just like on the curved pocket, I'm going to actually flip this up and see how well I stitched this on the ridge of that rolled hem that we did for the top of this pocket. We can also look here at the stitching, the stitch down for the pocket flap. Now, I want to point out a couple of things that I was going to correct, but then I thought, I want to teach you, I want this teaching moment here on this one. So remember that this pocket flap is an angle that follows similar angle, even though this is a little bit more pronounced. I still have the angle here on this pocket flap. So I still have a point here. And even though it's a softer point, I still want to show a point with a pivot. And if you look real close, I'm going to hold this up, I don't get a real pivot point here. It's kind of like a curved area. So I would probably circle that and say correct. So you want to correct that so that it doesn't reflect in your notebook. So along with that, the other thing that I would be looking for is how well does the pocket point at the bottom and the pocket point on the flap match? Do those match if I'm lining those right up in the middle? Well, it depends on where that is. So this pocket width is about 4 inches. So 2 inches right here is where my point is. So I want to make sure that point is right on the 2. And it looks like it may be slightly over. Now that may not be a big deal for this exercise, but if you're working with stripes or plaids and you're trying to match everything exactly, having that point off, even a 1/16 of an inch, is really going to mess up your eye line as far as the consistency. So I might measure that and say, yeah, we need to get that point over a little bit more. So I'd probably deduct a whole point for that. So I would probably go back and we could probably redo this flap, but why not just do the whole thing over and give yourself a little bit more practice? So one of the other things that I'm going to look at is I'm going to flip up this flap, and I'm going to look and I'm going to see a no-no. So I can see the raw edge here. So I'm going to deduct 2 points for that, easy. So the reason is because it doesn't look very professional. I don't want to see any of this extra seam allowance, right? So I would probably, if I were just going to correct this, I would take this stitching out, I would fold that back, I would trim that seam allowance back just a little bit more, and then I would fold it back down and redo my top stitching. And that's just to correct, not to redo a whole thing, right? So I wouldn't be looking at, so I don't want to see any of this raw edge peeking through. So the other thing that I want to point out is that I want to know that you actually fuse the top flap and not the under flap. I know that we have these markings for the top and that these markings are different from the under, but I would actually kind of pull this apart and I would use my fingers to feel, does this one feel like it's got that on there? Does this one feel like it doesn't? So that's what I would be looking for. If you had it reversed, I wouldn't even accept it. I would say do it over again. So that's how I would grade this one. So it looks like, I was a little bit inaccurate. You're probably saying, well, you're a professional. You should have had this perfect. But the thing is, I'm also here to teach you. And these are the things that you need to consistently look at for your work. Would this be acceptable? Would having the fusing on the other side be acceptable? These are the things that you need to ask. If you're going to be a designer, remember, people are going to be bringing the sewing back to you, and you're going to be looking it over. Is that acceptable to sell to your customer? You have to make that decision. If it is, well, maybe that's your standard. It's not my standard. So I would actually tell you, let's do another one. So if that were perfect, if everything looked good, then we could label this, and what we had labeled this at, this is our Western pocket. So we would call it Western patch pocket with flap. It's a long name, I know. And then of course, you're gonna put your name and the date. And if it were all good, this would be ready to put into the notebook.